Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Layout Building. In this episode, I'm going to continue to work on our N-scale Siren Creek project layout. I'll be installing some preliminary wiring and other electronic components. Our N-scale Siren Creek layout is designed to be small enough that Nichole and I can take it with us when we travel in our RV. It's also a way for me to do some model railroading while I'm waiting for the train room for my future HO scale layout to be completed. In the last episode, I put down cork roadbed for the layout. The cork will provide a base for all of the track work except for the two bridges. The layout is ready for track on top, but before I put any track down, I want to do some preliminary wiring. I'm using 14 gauge stranded wire from my main DCC bus. This is probably overkill for a layout this small, but I had the wire left over from another project and I thought I might as well use it. I have some barrier strips left over from a prior layout. I've also heard these called terminal blocks. I'll be using some of these to make a lot of my wiring connections. Spade connectors crimp onto the end of the wires and make it easier to connect the wires to the barrier strips. Cable ties are great for helping to keep wiring neat. For this episode, I'll be making a lot of use of this combination tool, which cuts and strips wire and can also be used to crimp the spade connectors. Some regular wire cutting pliers are also helpful. I've planned this from the beginning as a DCC layout. It may seem a little backwards, but I want to install some of the wiring before the track goes in. The reason for this is that I'm a firm believer in test as you go. I like to install a piece of track, then run a train on it immediately to see if there are any issues. Even the wiring for a small model railroad like this one can become complex in a hurry. In addition to track circuits, there will eventually be lighting circuits, circuits to power the switch machines, and maybe more. Tracing down a short or other problem in a maze of wires can be extremely difficult. That's why I want to take an incremental approach. Put in a pair of wires and test them. If there's a short and there wasn't any issue before, then it's probably one of those two wires. In order to do that kind of incremental testing, I need to be able to wire each piece of track to something. This is a Digitrax DCS100 command station that's close to 20 years old. Like the 14 gauge wire, it's probably overkill for a layout this small, but I plan to use something newer for my HO scale Donner Pass layout, so this is surplus. I want to mount it below the layout, but it lacks any convenient mounting holes. I'll need to make something to hold it. This is an HO scale freight car weight for my scrap box. I've already drilled out the holes in the ends to make them a little bigger. I'm going to locate most of the electronic components for the layout under the tunnel end, since there are no switch machines or other moving parts in that area. Right now the DCS100 is over the area where I intend to mount it. I've put the freight car weight under it. I'll mark the end holes with a pencil. Next I'll drill out the holes with a 3/8 drill bit. I'll hammer 5/16 18 T-nuts into each of the holes. I've put a piece of weather stripping on my car weight to act as a cushion. Now I can use a pair of 5/16 18 4-inch bolts through the weight to clamp the DCS100 in place. I'm mounting it upside down relative to the layout on purpose so that I can access the screws that secure the electrical connections. Now that the command station is in place, I can install more electronic components. I've placed 3 Digitrax DS64 stationary decoders in a row near the command station. These will eventually control the switch machines that will get installed at some point in the future. I'll secure them with screws. There are a lot of ways to wire a model railroad. I like to use barrier strips since all the connections are made with screws and can be easily changed later if need be. For now, I'll install several of these at key spots under the layout, again being careful to put them in places where I don't think they'll interfere with other components that I'll install later. I've installed my 2 Tam Frog Juicers on the opposite side of the center support from the command station. These are also under the tunnel area, so they should be out of the way of other components. These devices will take care of powering all of the turnout frogs on the layout, automatically switching polarity as needed. I find that the barrier strips work best with spade connectors. These fit 22 to 16 gauge wire, which is perfect for this layout. With some coaxing, these will also fit the 14 gauge wire I'm using. They have spade connectors for 14 gauge wire, but they're too big for my barrier strips. First, I'll strip a little insulation off one end of my 14 gauge bus wires. The tool has different slots for stripping different gauge wires. Once the wire is stripped, I can crimp a spade connector on the end. Then I can attach the spade connector to the barrier strip. By my own convention, I like to use red and black wire for track power. I'll pick other colors when it comes time to install structure lighting and other circuits. Unlike a DCC decoder installation, so far as I'm aware, there isn't an NMRA standard color coding scheme for layout wiring. Regardless, I would strongly recommend coming up with a color coding scheme and sticking with it. Even a small layout like this can end up with a lot of wire underneath, and color coding will make it easier to troubleshoot later. I'm going to twist my DCC bus wires together. From what I've read, this really isn't necessary on a layout this small. On larger layouts, it's supposed to help prevent DCC glitches that may cause locomotives to behave strangely. I'm doing it as a best practice and also to keep the wiring a little neater. Neatness definitely counts when it comes to layout wiring. I've connected the bus wires to the barrier strip near the command station. I've used some short lengths of wire to tie the bus into the command station's rail A and rail B connections. I put the red wire on rail A. The bus has a little slack in it. I wanted a little wiggle room so that I can tie it down more securely later and in case I need to move it slightly as I install more components under the layout in the future. I used some shorter wire to extend the bus to the other side of the center support on the passing siding end. I've done the same thing on the other end, terminating the bus near the Tam Frog Juicers. Experience has taught me that about 3 spade connectors is the maximum per screw on a barrier strip. I made these short wires to act as jumpers. I'll use them to connect the DCC bus to a different part of the barrier strip. There are also commercially available jumper bars that will accomplish the same thing. The instructions say that the DS64 can be powered either from the track or with a separate power supply. To keep things simple, I want to use track power, so I've made some 22 gauge wires to connect the DS64s to the DCC bus. The DS64s also have LocoNet connections, though someone at Digitrax once told me not to use both the track power and LocoNet at the same time, so I'm going to ignore those. So that I'm consistent with the way that I wired the command station, I'm connecting the red wires to the track A terminal screws on the DS64s and the black wires to track B. I think it would still work if the wires were reversed, but I like to be as consistent as possible with wiring. After connecting all 3 DS64s, I put some cable ties on the wires to keep things neat. Eventually, there will be many more wires hooked up to these decoders. On the other side of the center support, I've connected the track power to the 2 Tam Frog Juicers. I had to reconfigure the wiring here slightly to accomplish this, moving the DCC bus to a different set of screws and adding a pair of jumper wires, one reason that I like screw terminals. Now's a good time to test things. I've temporarily hooked up a power supply and throttle to the command station so that I can turn on the power. I want to make sure that there are no shorts and that the accessory components have power. It looks like a successful test. The DS64s have power and the Tam Frog Juicers do too. Sometimes it's good to have your work inspected by another set of eyes. The DCC Specialties power supply that I have works well, but it's heavy. To keep the layout's weight down, I've decided to keep it as an external component. To do that conveniently though, I'll need some way to quickly hook up the power supply to the layout. This is what I came up with. I had an old microphone cable that no longer worked, so I decided to cannibalize it and use the XLR connectors. These are 3-pin connectors which are perfect for the power circuit plus ground from the power supply. I bought a new recessed male connector and mounted it on a piece of wood left over from the layout benchwork. I'll solder the ground wire to the middle prong. I'm breaking with my color coding slightly here and using double black wires for the power. There will only be one set of wires like this on the entire layout, so I don't think it should get confused with the DCC bus. I've hooked up the power supply wires through the terminal strip. That will allow me to tap into the ground if needed. In the future, if I come up with some other way to connect the power supply, it'll be easy to change the wires without having to disturb the command station. The wiring to the command station is now complete. The layout has no programming track, so I won't be using those connections. The power supply jack is mounted behind one of the handholds. This cuts down on the size of the handhold a little, but only on the inside. The XLR jack makes it easy to attach the power supply to the layout. Having it recessed also works with my design goal of having nothing that's permanently attached to the layout stick out beyond the fascia. Now the basic track-related layout wiring is complete. I can solder feeder wires to the rails as I put them down and tie them into the DCC bus under the layout as I go. That will allow me to test the track as it's being constructed, but I'll save that part for the next episode. The layout is ready for track now, and that's what I'll be working on in the next episode. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.